Gene Paulson retired on a Friday afternoon in October, the same way he had ended most of his working weeks, by climbing out of a truck, walking into a building, and filling out paperwork. The paperwork this time was his retirement documentation rather than a service call report, but the physical sequence was nearly identical, and he noticed that without finding it particularly meaningful. He was 67 years old. He had been a field service technician for Massey Ferguson dealers across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa for 31 years, and before that he had worked 6 years in a dealer shop in central Minnesota learning the trade. He had been doing this work for 37 years total, which meant he had spent more of his adult life diagnosing and repairing farm equipment than he had spent doing anything else. He drove home that Friday and sat in the kitchen with his wife Carol and had a beer, and she asked him how it felt. He said it felt like a Friday. She laughed because she knew him well enough to know that was the most accurate answer he was capable of giving, and not a deflection. The following Monday, a journalist from a regional farming magazine called and asked if Gene would be willing to be profiled. The magazine ran a regular feature on people who had spent careers in agricultural service industries, dealers, agronomists, extension agents, the support structure around farming that didn't get the attention that farmers themselves did. Someone at one of the dealerships Gene had worked with had suggested his name. Gene said he wasn't sure he had much to say. The journalist said that in her experience, the people who said that were usually the ones worth talking to. He agreed to meet her for coffee on a Wednesday morning. He thought it would take an hour. It took most of the day. The journalist's name was Patricia Morse, and she was 44 years old and had been covering agricultural topics for most of her career. She had interviewed farmers, dealers, lenders, researchers, policy people. She knew the territory, and she knew how to ask questions that opened things up rather than close them down. She had expected Gene to talk about machines. She had expected the kind of interview she had done before with service technicians. Detailed, technical, full of specific repair stories and equipment anecdotes, and the professional pride of a man who had kept complicated machinery running under difficult conditions. That was a legitimate story, and she had written versions of it before. What she got was something different. Gene talked about machines when she asked about machines, and he was precise and knowledgeable and clearly at home in the technical material. But when she asked the broader questions, what do you remember most? What did the work teach you? What stays with you after 31 years? He kept coming back to the farmers, not the equipment, the farmers. She asked him to explain what he meant by that. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man deciding how much to say. Then he said that when you are a field service technician and you drive out to a farm to fix something, you arrive at a moment of stress. The machine is down. The farmer called because he cannot fix it himself or does not have time to try. There is crop in the field, or work that isn't getting done, or a deadline of some kind that the broken equipment is threatening. You walk into that situation as a stranger, or close to it, and you have a job to do that has nothing to do with the farmer's personal circumstances. But the personal circumstances are always present. You see them whether you intend to or not. You're in the yard, in the shop, in the field. You see the condition of the buildings. You see whether there are other people around or whether the farmer is alone. You hear what gets said and what doesn't get said. You develop over years of this work an ability to read a farm operation quickly and accurately, because the condition of the equipment and the operation around it tells you things that are relevant to your job. After a while, he said, you realize you are one of the very few people who sees the inside of these operations honestly. Not the face a farmer presents at the co-op or the equipment show or the neighbors' gathering, the actual condition of things. Patricia asked him what he did with that. He said mostly he did nothing with it. He fixed the machine and left. That was his job, and that was the appropriate boundary. She asked if there were cases that stayed with him. He said yes. She asked him to tell her about one. He thought for a moment. He said he would tell her about a call he made in the spring of 1997 in southwestern Minnesota, about 40 miles from the Iowa border. The call had come in through a dealer in the area, a hydraulic system failure on a Massey Ferguson 390, a tractor that had been acting up intermittently and had finally stopped functioning reliably in the middle of field work. The dealer's shop was backed up and the farmer needed the machine quickly, so Gene had driven out. The farm was medium-sized for the area, maybe 600 acres of corn and beans. The farmer was a man in his early 50s named Walter, and he had met Gene at the end of the lane and driven him out to where the tractor sat in the field. Walter was polite and gave Gene the information he needed about what the tractor had been doing and when the problem had started, and then he stepped back and let Gene work, which was the behavior of a man who understood what a service call was and didn't try to manage it. Gene worked for about 2 hours. It was a hydraulic pump issue with a secondary problem in the valve body that the pump failure had masked. Not unusual, but it required careful diagnosis to get the sequence right, because fixing the obvious problem without finding the underlying one would have left the tractor failing again within a season. He took his time. While he worked, he noticed things. The tractor was old for its hours, meaning it had been used hard. The maintenance record he could read from the machine's condition was inconsistent. Some things very well kept, other things deferred longer than they should have been. The field he was sitting in was in reasonable shape, but the fence rows showed neglect. One of the outbuildings visible from where he was parked had a roof line that had started to sag on one end. None of those things were his business. He noted them the way he noted everything, and he kept working. When he finished and started the tractor and walked Walter through what he had found and what he had done, Walter listened carefully and asked 2 or 3 precise questions that showed he understood machinery. Then he said something that was not a question about machinery. He said, "I don't suppose you can tell me whether it's worth putting that kind of money into a tractor at this point." Gene looked at him. The question was not really about the tractor. He said, "That depends on what the alternative looks like." Walter said the alternative was a newer machine he couldn't finance right now. He said his lender had been difficult for the past 2 years. He said the operation was in a position he hadn't expected to be in at his age, and that he was trying to hold things together until the prices improved or something else shifted. He said it in the flat, factual way that people report bad news when they have been living with it long enough that it no longer surprises them. Gene said he thought the tractor would run reliably if it was maintained from here forward. He said it honestly because it was true and because the man deserved an honest answer. He gave him his assessment of what else on the machine would need attention in the near term and what could wait. Walter thanked him. Gene wrote up the service ticket, packed his tools, and drove away. He thought about that farm for the rest of the day, and intermittently for a while after. He did not know what happened to it. He did not follow up. That was not his role. But he had seen something on that call that stayed with him. A competent, serious man trying to hold an operation together through circumstances that were not entirely his fault and that he was facing without much visible support. Patricia asked if he ever found out what happened. Gene said he ran into the dealer who had sent him out there about 2 years later and asked in a general way about the farm. The dealer said it had made it through. Walter was still farming. Things had stabilized. Gene said he had been glad to hear that. He said he hadn't realized until that moment how much he had been carrying the uncertainty of it. Patricia asked him how many calls he had made over 31 years. Gene said he had stopped counting, but his best estimate was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 individual service calls. Some of them were straightforward jobs that he drove to and completed and forgot about within a week. Some of them stayed with him in one way or another. She asked what made the difference between the ones that stayed and the ones that didn't. He thought about that for a while. He said it wasn't the difficulty of the repair. Though some of the technically complex jobs stayed with him for professional reasons, it wasn't the size of the farm or the value of the equipment. It was whether he had seen something during the call that told him something true about a person's situation. He said that farming is a private life. Farmers are not, as a group, people who discuss their circumstances openly. The culture discourages it. There is a premium on self-sufficiency and a stigma, often unspoken, around admitting that things are hard. He said he had made service calls to farms where the equipment was the smallest problem and the equipment was the only thing anyone was going to mention. He had a particular memory of a call in Iowa in the late fall of 2003 to a farm outside a small town in the northern part of the state. The job was a transmission problem on a Massey Ferguson 6180, a difficult repair in the field, the kind that usually should go to a shop, but the farmer had pushed for an on-site fix, and the dealer had agreed and sent Jean because he had the experience for it. The farmer was a woman in her early 60s named Margaret, and she was running the operation alone. Her husband had died 2 years earlier. She had 2 sons who were not in farming. She had kept the operation going herself, leasing out part of the ground and managing the rest with seasonal help. Jean had worked on the transmission for most of a day. Margaret had brought him coffee in the morning and lunch at noon, and had checked in periodically without hovering. She was competent around equipment, not a mechanic, but someone who had spent 40 years on a farm and understood the general principles of how things worked and what a repair like this involved. Late in the afternoon, when Jean was close to finishing, she had asked him a question that she clearly had been deciding whether to ask for most of the day. She asked him whether, in his experience, a solo operator could keep a farm like this running long-term, or whether the equipment demands eventually became unmanageable without another person who could handle the mechanical side. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. He told her that it depended on several things: the age and reliability of the equipment, the quality of the dealer support in the area, whether she had the resources to call for help when she needed it, rather than trying to manage mechanical problems herself and losing time. He told her that the farms he had seen run successfully by single operators over long periods were farms where the operator knew the limits of what they could handle alone and made calls like the one she had made today, rather than trying to push through problems that needed professional attention. He told her she had done the right thing calling when she called. She had nodded once and said thank you, and that had been the end of it. Jean had packed his tools and settled the paperwork with her and driven back toward the highway. He had thought about her operational question honestly during that drive, and he had concluded that he had given her the most useful answer he could give, which was not a guarantee, but was a set of conditions she could actually work with. Patricia was quiet for a moment after he finished telling this story. Then she said, "Do you know what happened with that farm?" Jean said he did, as it happened. He had made 2 more service calls to that farm over the following years. The second was in 2006 for a fuel system problem, and the third was in 2009 for an electrical fault. Both times Margaret had been there, running the operation, asking precise questions and staying out of his way while he worked. The last time he had seen her, she was in her late 60s, and the farm was in better condition than when he had first visited. He said that had been good to see. Patricia asked him if there was a story he remembered that he had not told anyone. Not because it was secret, but because it had never come up. Jean was quiet for longer than usual. He refilled his coffee. He looked out the window of the diner where they were sitting at the street outside, which was an ordinary small-town Minnesota street with nothing particular happening on it. He said there was a call he had made in Wisconsin in the summer of 2011 that he thought about more than most. He had driven out to a farm in the western part of the state to look at a Massey Ferguson 5460 that had been running rough and losing power under load. Standard diagnostic call, nothing unusual in the dispatch. He had arrived mid-morning and found the farm tidy and the equipment well maintained, and the farmer, a man named Dennis, who was in his mid-40s, waiting for him in the yard. Dennis had been pleasant and organized and had a clear account of the symptoms and their timeline. Jean had started the diagnostic work and within an hour had a good picture of what was happening: an injector issue with a secondary air intake problem that was compounding it. Straightforward once you found it, time-consuming to correct properly. What Jean had noticed during that morning was that Dennis checked his phone repeatedly. not in a distracted way, in the way of a man waiting for a specific message that had not arrived. Around noon, Dennis had gone inside. When he came back, he had been quieter than before. He had not said anything about it, and Jean had not asked. In the early afternoon, while Jean was still working, a woman had come out of the house and spoken to Dennis briefly. Jean had not heard what was said. Dennis had come over a few minutes later and said he was sorry, but he needed to go, and asked if Jean was able to finish up on his own and leave the key in the usual place. Jean said of course. Dennis had thanked him and walked back to the house. Jean had finished the repair, tested the tractor, written up his notes, and left the key where Dennis had indicated. He had thought about the interrupted quality of that afternoon for a long time afterward. He had thought about the phone, and the quietness, and the woman coming out of the house, and the way Dennis had said he was sorry when asking Jean to finish alone, saying sorry not because it was an inconvenience, but because he was a person who apologized when circumstances pulled him away from a commitment. He had not made another call to that farm. He had not followed up. He did not know what had happened that afternoon. He said he thought about it occasionally, because it was one of the cases where he had seen something true about a person's situation without understanding what the situation was, and the not knowing had stayed with him more than the knowing usually did. Patricia asked if he had ever considered trying to find out. He said he hadn't. He said his job had been to fix the machine, and he had fixed it, and what was happening in that house on that afternoon was not his business and never had been. He said he hoped it had come out all right. Patricia said she thought that was probably the most honest thing a person could say about it. They had been talking for over 6 hours by the time the diner was setting up for its dinner service, and the staff began moving around them with a polite purposefulness that meant it was time to go. Patricia had enough material for a feature. She had, in fact, more than she could use. More stories, more detail, more of the quiet and specific texture of 31 years moving through the back roads of 3 states and arriving at farms at moments of mechanical failure and seeing what was there. She asked Jean, as they stood up to leave, whether there was anything he wanted to make sure was in the piece. He thought about it. He said he wanted people to understand that the work had been good work, that there was something worth doing in being the person who could fix the machine when the machine was down and the season was running. He had been that person for a long time and he did not take it lightly. She said she understood. He said the other thing was that the farmers he had worked with over those years were, as a group, more capable and more serious and more quietly determined than most people who didn't know farming would imagine. He said he had seen people hold things together under circumstances that would have undone most people, and do it without complaint and without expecting anyone to notice. He said that was worth saying plainly. Patricia wrote that down. She published the profile 6 weeks later. Jean read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with coffee that was still hot, and Carol sitting across from him reading something else. He read it carefully, the way he read service manuals, looking for accuracy, checking details. He told Carol it was pretty good. She asked if they had gotten it right. He said mostly. He said there were a few things they had summarized that he would have described differently, but that the shape of it was accurate. She asked if he was glad he had talked to them. He thought about that honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. He said yes. He said some of it had been worth saying out loud after 31 years of mostly keeping it to himself. Then he finished his coffee and went out to the garage to work on something he had been meaning to get to. Because a man who has spent his life fixing things does not stop needing to fix things just because the job is over. The work changes form. The need for it doesn't.